and our new topic, apologetics. Now, I have met people who are very apologetic, but that's not the same thing. Might say, well, what is it if it isn't saying I'm sorry? Well, it comes from a Greek word, apologia, which was a technical term originally for a speech made before a court of law in one's own defense. And it came to be, as a technical term, an area of study that seeks to defend an idea or a belief. Now, Christian apologetics has been, since the beginning of, the church, because there have always been people who would like to say that the church is something other than it is, that Christianity is something other than it is. And God has always raised up people who have the qualifications, the special qualifications, to make a very effective defense. Now, it blurs a little bit with evangelism, because it is basically speaking the gospel. But it differs specifically in two main regards. First, on an emphasis on reasoning. And the second, on the presence of opposition. Now, evangelism can go out and speak whether or not there are, where people are listening agreeably or disagreeably. Apologetics exists specifically because of the disagreeable. It's where there's opposition. This week, we are just going to kind of do an overview. We're going to look at the book of Acts primarily. So if you want to open up to the book of Acts, starting round about chapter 17-ish and going forward. And we'll look at, first we're going to look at Paul. Paul lived to defend the gospel against opposition. It's like his favorite thing to do. He would do it even when there was serious physical danger threatened. And there was an instance where, if you read closely, his friends told him, "You are not going out there to argue with these people." And they stopped him. But if you look, starting in chapter 17, they were traveling. Let's put it this way. Paul would preach, people would believe, other people would disagree severely, and the believers would then hustle Paul onward to protect him. And this happens in a series of towns. And when they sent them, the brothers, we're looking at verse 10 of chapter 17, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. So they sneak him out of town, and they go there, they go to the Jewish synagogue, and they speak with them. And many there believed, but when the Jews from the previous town, where they had been smuggled out, found out that they were there, they came too and started agitating against them. And there, the Berean brothers immediately sent Paul off. You see the pattern. While Silas and Timothy remained there. And the people from Berea who were escorting Paul dropped him at Athens and went back to tell Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. And I think it was possibly a bad idea that they left Paul there on his own, because he's left in a city full of idols. And it says in the ESV, it describes it as his spirit was provoked within him. So when someone who likes to debate gets very provoked, you know what's going to happen. It says he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. Okay, that's his normal MO. But he also goes to the marketplace to reason with those who happened to be there. So he's in the synagogues talking with the Jews. That's his area of expertise, if you'll recall. His background was as a Pharisee in the law. So knowing that the law says this, the prophets say this, he goes there and reasons with them. But he's also out in the marketplace, in the open forum, with people who are described in this way. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul the novelty walks in and says, let me tell you about Jesus and the resurrection. And their response says, what is this guy saying? And some are like, oh, he's preaching foreign divinities because he's talking about Jesus. And of course, in the Greek, the resurrection is anastasis. You might recognize that. Anastasia is a name we still use. So they're thinking the god Jesus and the goddess Anastasis? What's this all about? And so they take him and they bring him to the Areopagus, which was an open forum for religious discussion. And I love the fact that they say that they take him and bring him to the Areopagus. You get this feeling that he's just sort of carried along by the crowd. They're like, oh, hey, we got to take this guy over here because these are the people who talk about religion. So he stands up in their midst, right? What's he going to say? Is he going to say, now, God spoke to the Jews and presented them with the truth, and throughout their scriptures, there's this no, he's not going to say that, because these people couldn't care less what God said to the Jews. But he does say, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. Now, some people interpret this as a compliment, but it's actually a very neutral term. It's like you got a lot of interest in religion. For I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. And boy, did he. Because remember, when he came through and he observed the objects of their worship, he was provoked. He says, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Because when you're a pantheist, you may have your favorite gods, but you got to be careful not to offend any of them, even the ones you may not know about. So Paul uses this altar, this catch-all, unknown God altar, to start speaking to them about the God they don't know. The one God who made heaven and earth, who needs nothing from humans, who does not live in temples or does not receive service from humans because he needs it. But rather, he himself, this is in verse 25, gives to all mankind life and breath and everything, and made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek him. He describes it as they feel their way toward him and find him. There's this blindness implied. And he quotes from their own poetry. Now, this is a curious thing for a Pharisee, ex-Pharisee, to know secular Greek poetry. But he does. And he starts to describe who God is in terms that they will understand. And he finishes his message. The times of ignorance, right? This blindness where people may or may not grope their way toward knowledge of God. These times of ignorance, God overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. If you go through this, you will notice very markedly that he never names Jesus. But as he's coming to the end, he approaches. There is a man whom God has appointed to judge the world. And the assurance that God has given people that this is true is the resurrection. And of course, as soon as this group hears him speak of the resurrection of the dead, it says some mocked, because obviously everybody knows, scientific people know, the dead don't come back to life. But some people say to him, we'd like to hear you about this again. This is intriguing. And so Paul went out from their midst. They let him go, basically. But some people believed and followed him. This is one of those experiences that we have of the defense of the gospel in a context where it is entirely unknown. And we see Paul making connections to things they do know. This altar of the unknown God. He uses that as a connection. There is a God you don't know. There is one God, and you don't know him. This is how he's moving people closer to a fuller knowledge. And of course, as some of your own poets have said, it's their own literature, speaking to them in their own language. Now, this is apologetics, because it's no good going out and telling people, well, this is what the Bible says, if they don't believe that the Bible is true. You have to work them around to things like, why do you believe the Bible? Why isn't it just this other book? But there are other kinds of apologetics, right? Sorry, I can't talk today. I don't know what it is. The instance in Athens was basically the gospel versus paganism. But that wasn't by any means all that Paul did. In fact, a lot of his work, his primary work, seemed to be the gospel against Judaism, which must have been a very peculiar situation for him. But in all sorts of situations, Paul is going around making a defense of the gospel against those who would say either it doesn't matter or it's a lie. When he's arrested in the temple, well, technically rescued in the temple by people, by the Romans, for things that they don't understand, but they know that if they don't do something, this mob is going to kill this man. And we'd rather they didn't until we find out if he ought to be killed. But as he's being escorted out of the temple, he asks to speak to the people who are trying to kill him. I mean, like actively trying to kill him. And so with this Roman bodyguard around him, he stands and he speaks. He makes his defense. In fact, that's how he starts. He says, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And he begins with his own testimony. Where was he born? Where was he brought up? How was he educated? That he was a persecutor of the way. zealously pursuing it all over the place, and yet was confronted by a vision that a great light knocked him to the ground, and Jesus spoke to him. And from this time, he says, he serves. If you look at chapter 22, verse 17, this is toward the end of, well, it's probably not the end of what he meant to say, but it's the end of what they let him say. Because he says, when I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And at this point, the crowd, which had been paused, hits fast forward on their, let's kill this guy. They start shouting and basically throwing down their coats and flinging dust in the air. And the Romans are like, all right, we're done here. And they pull him into the safe environs of their barracks. He keeps doing this. So he's in the temple in front of people who are actively seeking to kill him. The next day, he goes into the Sanhedrin, and it doesn't go any better than it did in the temple. The tribune is to the point where the tribune is afraid that they're going to start pulling Paul to pieces with their bare hands. And this leads him on this chain of defenses. He's taken to Caesarea to be imprisoned. And he gives his defense in front of the governor. The governor basically puts him off until somebody else comes. And it's this sequence of people of very high importance in the Roman government of the area, and every one of them is brought in front of Paul for him to give a defense of the gospel to them. In fact, Felix, the governor, comes and sends for Paul just to listen to him talk. And I love the bit in chapter 24, verse 25, that as Paul reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, he frightens the governor, basically. Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. I'll send for you some other time. Paul's defense is that effective. Felix is succeeded by Porcius Festus. Porcius Festus finds out he's inherited this prisoner that nobody knows what to do with. And he has King Agrippa and his wife come to greet him when he arrives. And lo and behold, let's have Paul out and see what he has to say. And Paul comes before them. And chapter 26 of Acts is almost entirely Paul talking to them about the gospel. Now, we're talking about kings, governors, people who would never have gone out to hear itinerant preachers, people who apparently were not particularly interested in righteousness And Paul, all he says is, ha, opportunity. To the point where, as he is speaking his defense, his apology, Festus interrupts him and says, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. And Paul says, no, I'm not. I'm not out of my mind, but I am speaking true and rational words. And he turns to the king, says, the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly, for I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa says, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul's response is really the heart of apologetics. He says, short time or long, I would to God that not only you, but all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Now, I was a bit reluctant, I will admit, to go into the subject of apologetics because personally, I have a serious problem with conflict. It makes me nauseated. I get freaked out. I don't like it at all. But I asked myself this week, why? Why do this? Because is there any point in speaking to those who have already made up their minds, who reject the gospel with all they are? And of course, as I'm reading Paul's story, the answer is, of course, yes, because you look at Paul himself. No one could have rejected the gospel more fervently than he had, and yet look at what he became. But also, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before as I was going through Acts. In between Paul's stay in Corinth and his arrival in Ephesus, there's this mention of a person named Apollos. And of course, what we know of Apollos is that he was eloquent, he was competent in the scriptures, but he began with only an understanding as far as the baptism of John, of the repentance. And of course, we know that he was taken under the wing of Priscilla and Aquila, and they explained to him the way of God more accurately. But this phrase that I hadn't noticed before, chapter 18, verse 27 and 28, of course. It said, when he, Apollos, wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed. For he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. It doesn't say that he won over many Jews by his eloquence. What happened was he helped those who already believed. And if we're talking about signposts that point us to the kingdom, those people whose special ability to take on the opponents of the gospel are of great help to those of us who don't have that ability. And of course, as I looked at how much apologetics had to do with the early church, there's no way I could say, well, what's the point? If you look at all of the writings from the 1st century onward through 5th century, you will find again and again that the writings that survive are predominantly apologetic in nature. You have Justin Martyr. He died somewhere in the neighborhood of 165 AD. And he wrote 2 works titled Apologia that were addressed to the Roman emperor, saying, basically, Christians are actually better citizens for their worship of the one God than they would have been if they had stayed pagans and worshiped the emperor. So could you possibly treat them according to their actions instead of just according to just the fact that they're Christians? Tertullian, he died sometime after 200 AD. His most famous, I think, work would be his Apologetics, which is again addressed to the Roman emperor and the authorities, talking to them about who Christians really are. Eusebius, he died somewhere around the neighborhood of 340 AD. His work, Preparation for the Gospel, if you even look it up in Wikipedia, it is described as an attempt to prove the excellence of Christianity over pagan religions and philosophies. Of course, you have to talk about Augustine, or Augustine if you prefer, who died somewhere, I think it was 430 AD. Practically everything he wrote, apart from his confessions, was a defense of the gospel, but particularly his City of God, full title, On the City of God Against the Pagans, which was to answer accusations against Christianity, saying that Christians had caused the downfall of the Roman Empire. Now, I won't expect you to go back and read these because they are kind of a hard read. I will admit that. I still have vivid, rather unpleasant memories from my second year of college being required to read the City of God and write a report on it. I never actually made it to the end. It is so long. And it is really hard to wade through. To be honest, I don't think it was a fair assignment for one semester. But we will look at several modern, and I do use that word a little loosely because our first one was end of the Victorian era into the 20th century. But we will look at 3 authors who spoke to the philosophies of their times. And the first one, of course, is G.K. Chesterton, who was such a quirky person by himself. But he reasoned with, or even against, the modern literati, the philosophers of his day, in the modern era which said, it doesn't really matter what you believe, it only matters what you do. And he takes great issue with that, as well he might, considering that what you do springs from what you believe. We will look at Ravi Zacharias, who, of course, just died recently. Apparently, John's really happy about that. And
not that he died.
Not that he died. Not that he died. That we will be reading Ravi Zacharias talking about him. Thank you for clarifying that, John. And his reasoning with other world religions. And then we'll also look at John Lennox, a Northern Ireland mathematics professor, I think, who takes on the new atheists the philosophy of science. So next week, primarily I'll be looking at Chesterton's Heretics. If you want to, I do actually recommend that you read these books because they are fairly easy to read and they are really useful. Ravi Zacharias, Jesus Among Other Gods. John Lennox, God's Undertaker. So that is something to look forward to. And I have to say, as much as I dislike conflict, I really appreciate how these men handle the conflict in the defense of the gospel. It's a good example and it's an encouragement. So we begin in earnest next week.